On the 16th of January 2007, players flocked to the Blasted Lands in anticipation of the Dark Portal finally opening. Server communities had defeated everything vanilla had to offer. They were veterans of patch 1.12's PvP welfare epics. So, 10 new levels, 10 new talent points, and a whole world of adventure lay for them beyond that portal. The pre-patch saw High Lord Gruul launch his invasion of Azeroth. And this was an invasion that actually was our justification for the entire Outland journey, where we would bring war upon these demons just like we did in Warcraft 2 Beyond the Dark Portal. Now, in reality, High Lord Gruul was a world boss. He was one with an intense enrage timer though, so he wasn't that easy. And then you could kill 10 of his demons to earn the Tabard of the Protector. Of course, we did. People earned their tabards, and with this invasion defeated, it was time for the big event. At 1 minute past midnight, the Dark Portal roared to life. Players' launch night experience would then diverge. Some people went straight through the Dark Portal, but others rolled a new character. First though, we'll talk about those intrepid Outland pioneers. For those who braved the Dark Portal, launch night was a little bit rough. You see, this was still the era where servers were a single solid community, and with everybody, nearly, wanting to hit level 70, this led to issues that would cause Blizzard to learn some lessons. First, the portal led to one single zone, Hellfire Peninsula. So at that moment, hundreds of players disgorged onto the Stairs of Destiny, with one quest route per faction. And this meant that wars raged over every mob tag, the Hellfire fortification objectives, and pretty much everything else in the zone. Now, when you did get an opportunity to take a little breather from the gameplay and actually look around yourself and look up, what you saw was breathtaking. And this needs to be reinforced. Blizzard had never produced such a stunning skybox, with giant moons and pure streams of the twisting nether. That initial zone, on launch night, was incredibly impressive. The landscape was alien, like nothing on Azeroth, with Hellfire Citadel dominating the skyline. And then, just when you thought you were safe from the fell orcs and the PvP, your screen would shake, you turn your camera, and... Sure, Hellfire is not a well-regarded zone today. I think that is the case, but at the time, it left an impression. It was something daring, bold, and new. It was unlike anything people had experienced on Azeroth before. The Burning Crusade represented a large iteration on the game that had came before it. The initial flow of quests was, yes, slow, but overall, for a lot of people, better and smoother. Quests were more organized into hubs, so when you traveled to a new zone, a breadcrumb would take you to the heart of the action. Hubs usually would have all of the vendors you would need, plus an inn. And while this stuff is all very normal nowadays, it was a welcome shift from the extreme travel time of some of Vanilla's questing. Hubs also allowed the quest writers to forge a more consistent narrative throughout the zones. You'd begin in Hellfire, you'd make your way to Honor Hold or Thrallmar, literal ruins from the Second War, and immediately you'd get a sense of how cut off you were. Next, you'd grind your way through some foul orcs, learning the first hints that Illidan had in fact been experimenting with the blood of the Pit Lord Magtheridon to create his own breed of orc. Then, engaging the Forge camps, we would learn that the Legion still claimed Outland as their own. Side quest hubs then became a way to build out scenes to bulk out the lore, so that our introduction to the broken tribes, of course the devolved vestiges of the Draenei and Outland, left an impression. Similarly, we met the Mag-Har, the last true orcs in Outland, hiding out in the mountains of Hellfire. meaning that of course later, when we found the Mag'har city of Garadar and Nagrand, it felt like the next big step in that arc. Your trip to Hellfire would also involve big crystals, the fallen Arakoa, and the ghosts of the Second War. But eventually, you would get your few levels of experience out of Hellfire, and at about level 62, it was time to move on. You descended through Thornfang Hill, and Blood Red slowly gave way to Alien Blue. You were now in Zangarmarsh. The first hub brought us around Umbrathon Lake, where we killed some evil Broken, and we discovered that the Naga are draining the marsh, all something that was part of Illidan's grand plan, which can be summarized as this: he who controls the water controls Outland. Zangarmarsh had some great quest hubs, like say the Sporagar, a faction reputation based in saving these little mushroom people with their, to this day, rather unique tabard. Next though, you'd be invited to visit the city of Shattrath, nestled away in the mysterious Terracor forest. Once the center of Draenei civilization, now, of course, a ruin. The Bone Wastes would dominate to the south, hosting the dead city of Auchindoun, a fascinating dungeon hub that we'll explore later. In Shattrath, a haggard war veteran told us to go to Adal. And this was, for many people, their first interaction with a Naru. And its lack of dialogue and calming chime just drove this incredible cosmic mystery. They were so weird and different. Who the hell were these Naru? People asked themselves many questions. Luckily, Khadgar was on hand to explain everything. So he summoned what must be his slowest servant to give us a tour of the city. And this servant told us that Adal leads a faction of Naru called the Shattar, who we now know are part of the Army of the Light, a group that of course we would meet in Legion. He goes on to tell us about the two dominant factions in the city. First, the Aldor, a group of light fanatics and another wing of the Army of the Light. They represent the last native Draenei priesthood on the planet. Secondly, then, the Scryers, a group of blood elves who followed their leader Kel'Thas to Outland. But when commanded to attack Shattrath, the Scryers amassed outside the city, ready for war, but unexpectedly, they laid down their weapons. Their leader, Voronthal, demanded to speak with Adal, and after doing so, he pledged the Scryers to the Shattar. By the time Khadgar's tour was over, and players had had a look around themselves, they would find this incredible mixing pot where so many different races and cultures, those lost, forgotten, persecuted, all came together in one great mixing pot. Truly something that felt unique from Azeroth, and an incredible place for our first off-world base of operations. There was still much of Outland to explore. Terracor gave way to the rolling hills of Nagrand. This was the closest we got to seeing an Orcish homeland before Warlords of Draenor. Some notable locations were Garadar, the Mag'har capital, Oshu'gun, the massive crystal with a Naru at its core that was actually a spaceship. Similarly, we got to see the Ogre's stronghold in Blade's Edge Mountain, and Blade's Edge as a zone was experimental in design. Split into various subzones with sheer walls separating them, you'd really need a flying mount to have a good time. Then cranking in the cosmic element, Netherstorm was a region representing the disintegration of Draenor into Outland. Somehow, goblins had beat us to it and already set up the thriving research station of Area 52. And then finally, there was the desolate Shadowmoon Valley, the ultimate representation of cosmic doom in this expansion. It was home to Illidan's fortress, the Black Temple, a structure at the heart of villainy since Warcraft 2, and where there was a slight retcon, in that Hellfire Citadel and Black Temple used to be in the same place, but they were actually separated for this expansion, which was a good thing, because it did mean more content for us. Now that we know the route players took, let's take a look at the dungeons they cleared along the way. Because dungeons were actually organized into hubs, and in a far bigger way than they are today. Dungeons were relatively short as compared to some of Vanilla's affairs, but they had multiple wings. And overall, it meant we got a lot of content. And best of all, they synergized with leveling perfectly. There was always a dungeon wing in your zone with enough people in general to pug. The expansion launched with 15 instances spread across 4 hubs. Hellfire Citadel had 3 dungeon wings and the one boss Magtheridon raid. Then, the dungeon hub at the heart of Zanger Marsh's Serpent Lake had 3 dungeons and the Serpentshrine Cavern raid. Then, the Crypt City of Auchindoun was a great example of being able to get loads of lore packed into one location. One wing filled with ethereals, another with Arakoa, and yet another with the Orcish Shadow Council. It wasn't just Outland that got this treatment, though. Players had been fascinated with the Caverns of Time since the Ahn'Qiraj War effort, and they were about to get their opportunity to enter it. Again, the design here was impressive. It's no wonder that, at least on my boxed copy of the game, it took center stage with its big open rock face bleeding out into the twisting nether. The conceit here was a neat one, that we would be able to travel back to significant events in order to stop the villainous infinite dragonflight from destroying the timeline. We then can't forget Tempest Keep and the dungeons that came along with it, with their just incredibly different vibe, of course, essentially being Draenei interdimensional fortresses, something that was quite a change in pace from the regular content people had come to expect from World of Warcraft. Now, these dungeon hubs brought together the various different quest hubs into the more sort of upped-ante encounters, right? The conclusion of storylines. For an example, visiting Thrall's grandmother in Nagrand led us to kill High Exarch Maladar in Auchindoun and then to free the Naru Duor. Getting into the normal versions of these dungeons would require, often, keys, and their heroic versions required rep grinds, quest chains, and keys to enter. We'll go over all of that, of course, when we talk about attunements, a major feature or headache of this expansion, depending on your opinion. But first, let's see what it was like rolling a new character. There was a second, less intense experience of launch night, and that was rolling a new character. World of Warcraft's 2 new races were a big deal. But here's the thing, the leveling experience hadn't actually changed, and players were still signing up for a weeks-long process of traveling around the old world. And this is something that will actually be different in World of Warcraft Classic The Burning Crusade than it was on Live. That's because Classic The Burning Crusade is actually shipping with a quest XP, an XP requirement change, that would only happen a good chunk into the Burning Crusade expansion. So at launch, questing, especially from 0 to the new cap of 70, it was a serious undertaking. Of course, there were good reasons to take on that new challenge. Many people understood the big time investment, but they knew that they needed their Horde Paladins, or their Alliance Shamans. They needed them to be ready to raid Karazhan. Or perhaps you just like the look of those new blue aliens, or maybe you've wanted to play a Blood Elf since Warcraft 3. Alternatively, you could have been one of the nearly 2 million, relatively new World of Warcraft players. So, let's take a look at these new races. First up, the Blood Elves. Players might have been mistaken for believing that the Blood Elves were the expansion's antagonists, as Kael'thas was of course one of the 3 main villains. And it's just that thing, if you did not read the quest text in these days, you would be rather confused. But no, these Blood Elves were in fact left behind in Silvermoon, and they never fell to the Legion corruption that happened to Kael'thas and the people who followed him. So spawning in Sunstrider Isle, we were introduced to their magical nature with these incredible just animated brooms and new particle effects and mobs, all those little details that told us that these were a very different group to, of course, the Night Elves who they were once a part of, many, many years ago. Then, we went into the ruins of Silvermoon, clearing the wretched grounded us, really, in the elven struggle, that these people had lost so much, and that even after Arthas carved his way through their kingdom, they were still suffering. And as we ventured out across the Scar and into Silvermoon for the first time, it was exciting. Silvermoon was glorious. It was like nothing we had ever seen before. I remember it blowing my young mind, as compared to the rest of what I'd seen in the game universe. And this was before Dalaran, right? Before we'd seen sights like that. So those big towers stretching up into the sky, they seemed to have a graphical fidelity and shine that even Outland lacked. Players would then continue their adventure through the tranquil Eversong forest, getting the Blood Elf people back onto their feet, and then it was out into the Ghostlands to forge new partnership with the Forsaken, and for the Blood Elf people to take their place with the Horde. Blood Elves could not roll warriors, but it didn't matter because the Blood Elf Paladin became an extremely common sight and a staple of Horde raiding. Blood Elf casters then had a unique bump in PvP because they had access to an area of effect silence and a stackable mana tap as racials. Pretty damn powerful. All around, Blood Elves became an incredibly popular group, having the most player characters in the Horde, not only throughout the Burning Crusade, but in fact, throughout every single expansion, right up to Shadowlands. The most popular Horde race, it is the Blood Elves. The announcement of the Draenei was, similarly, met with a little bit of confusion. Probably more confusion than with the Blood Elves, to be honest. Because sure, we'd seen Draenei before. Of course, as those hunched over, deformed, broken that we helped Illidan capture the Black Temple with in Warcraft 3. But what we saw in this expansion was a radical recharacterization of Akama's people. It changed what people thought Draenei were. Now, these Draenei were utterly steeped in the lore of the Burning Crusade. They were exiles, and in fact Draenei means Exiles One in their own language, from the planet of Argus. They were survivors of a civil war that saw the Eredar take their place as the Legion's commanders. And this was all fresh new lore, even changing what people thought of Sargeras. They were dedicated to the mysterious new Naru, who were sort of considered to be, well, one of, if not the, most powerful entities in the lore at that time. And their leader, Velen, has become since an essential part of the lore. But sadly for them, Azure Mist and Blood Mist Isle just did not leave an impression on players. Likewise, the Axadar was impressive with Big Naru at its heart, but it quickly became the least visited Alliance city. Their lore then was new and confusing. People didn't think about the game in cosmic terms as they do now, and their lore did actually include retcons. Retcons that now feel quite natural, but at the time were jarring. Narrative confusion aside, the Alliance was extremely glad to have shamans on their side. You see, Horde raid clear times throughout vanilla had been faster, and the community generally put this down to the Horde having more throughput potential in their racial abilities, and of course, having shamans. Bloodlust, giving everybody a massive power boost, was of course extremely hard to beat. Otherwise then, the Draenei had Gift of the Naru as their racial. It was a weak heal over time, but downtime was a big consideration. That meant that, just for leveling, having this racial made the likes of warriors just that bit more appealing. Of course, the default gameplay experience at this time was to fight one or two mobs, and then to have a little sit down for 10 to 30 seconds. Well, if you've got Gift of the Naru, it can help out. They of course also had increased chance to hit, which would help them hit their hit cap, and also an affinity to the new profession, jewel crafting. It would take a few more years for the Draenei to really find their place in the lore, But at least for right now in the Burning Crusade, we got tantalizing hints of this world called Argus, we got shamans for the Alliance, and people thought they looked pretty cool. They were generally quite well loved, along with their Blood Elf counterparts. Meaning that really, the new races added to the Burning Crusade were a tremendous success for Blizzard. Jewel crafting was a new primary profession that fueled this new socket system that was on gear. Now, as we know, sockets are native to certain pieces of epic gear, and they would allow you to further augment your stat loadout. What you may not know as a player of the modern game, though, is that at this time, there were red, yellow, and blue sockets. Now, if you color coordinated the color of your gems to the sockets on your gear, you would in fact get an additional stat bonus. Now, there were primary colored gems, but there was also gems of combined colors. So if one of the primary colors was in one of the mixed colored gems, like you're mixing paints back in school, then you'd still get the bonus. And this was a system that allowed a lot of stat customization. They were seen at the time as a natural evolution of classic gear progression, and they fast became a great and quite well-loved tool for hitting your stat goals. You see, you've got to remember that at this time in the game, you had to reach your hit cap. You had to reach your expertise cap if you actually wanted to do damage on enemies. Of course, you'd maybe need to hit defense cap if you were a tank. These things were a vital concern. They're not a part of the game now, but with those being important, anything that would let you tweak your stat loadout was greatly appreciated by players. By the time the Burning Crusade came around, Blizzard was really beginning to understand the way that players wanted to augment their gear and work out their class. And this is something that's really true for so many aspects of the game. You see, the vanilla class forums were a hardcore place. Blizzard were under a lot of pressure to solve problems from players, and a new expansion seemed like the time to do it. Bringing the talent tree to 41 points allowed Blizzard to rebuild many specs, even adding capstone talents that players, for the most part, were excited by and actually wanted. And this is things like Shadow Step, making rogues a monster in PvP. These capstone talents, they gave us so many class-defining abilities that we couldn't really imagine not having today. Things like Divine Shield, Mutilate, Rampage, Shadow Fury. Classic, you see, suffered from meme specs. Balanced Druid was a joke. Rat Paladins were unthinkable. And don't get me wrong, in Burning Crusade, Shamans still were some of the best healers, and Ret was still some of the worst DPS. There was outsiders as well, like Beastmaster Hunters dominating throughout the expansion. But overall, the key takeaway here is that Blizzard were beginning to understand not just a class's place in the game, but also the place of each spec in the game, independent of class. So really, no matter what spec you wanted to play, even Rat Paladins, you would find more of a place in endgame content here than in the past. An example of this change in class design is Defiance. Now, Defiance was a core talent for protection warriors. It increased their threat generation, so core to a tank. Now in vanilla, it was 5 points out of your 31 talent points, so a pretty significant investment. In the Burning Crusade, they changed it to only be 3 points out of your total of 41, and with some expertise slapped on as well. And that meant that you got a little bit more actual utility and less of an investment overall, and that freed you up. So basically, lots of small changes like this one, they opened up the viability of off-meta tanking and leveling for warriors. They'd let you hybrid it up a bit more. And generally speaking, throughout all of the specs, this is the sort of stuff that Blizzard was taking a look at. Perhaps the bus shock incident of vanilla was one too many and they just wanted to get more of a handle on these things. You've rolled your character, fought through vanilla leveling, went through the dark portal, and are now level 70. It is time to earn your flying mount. The Burning Crusade's physical box featured flying right at the top, and that is how excited players were about the prospect of soaring over Outland. The game introduced the new expert riding skill, and it only cost 800 gold. Now that still was an investment for the day, but the trade-off with this was 60% flying speed. So it was actually slower than your ground mount, but it was generally faster because you could hop over obstacles going as the crow flies. Now, the truly practical way to fly was the artisan riding skill. This increased your flying speed to a massive 280%, but it cost a huge 5,000 gold. And that was an insane, a massive investment at that particular time, to the point where many casual players really ended up having to, well, either farm up primals, which were crafting resources for many months, or just wait to Wrath of the Lich King and earn the gold there. Now, the Alliance got griffins and the Horde got wyverns. There were other flying mounts throughout the expansion, though, but they were always prestigious items that required a lot of work, and that meant that flying around not on a griffin was a pretty damn cool thing. There was the Netherwing Drake that required a quest chain, farming up Drake eggs, killing many Dragon Maw orcs, even doing the racing minigame. And incidentally, the Netherwing quest chain, to actually earn this mount, it was the first time we actually got to interact with Illidan in the entire expansion. He was a villain that loomed over everything, but he was otherwise absent. Like, he was absent from the leveling experience. It was only when you went to get this mount that you would see some of the big man himself. Now, there were a few other options as well, such as engineers being able to create a flying machine and its turbocharged epic variant. There was then the Cenarian Hippogriff, which cost 1,600 gold at Exalted Rep. And finally, the Armored Nether Drake that gave you 310% flying speed, but you'd have to be in the top 0.5% of contenders in your battle group. So it was the ultimate prestige mount for PvPers. Of course, there was more, and it wasn't all there at launch. There was the likes of Scatus and all of the farming up of various different reagents in that gameplay loop to get your nether rays. A pretty incredible experience and a massive new set of goals for players. We could talk endlessly about the legacy of flight in the game and its impacts, because it's something Blizzard still struggles with right up to today. But if there's one thing you need to understand about flight in the Burning Crusade, it was that players absolutely loved it, and for many, it was a North Star for their character. Once you reached level 70, it was time to enter the world of TBC's endgame. And this meant one thing: attunements. Remember, everything I said about quests being well organized and being straightforward, well, you could say it's about to go out the window, because every attunement brought you to, well, just every desolate corner of Outland, and in some cases even back to Azeroth. Now, attunement wasn't simply a process of you getting keys or getting an intro to certain dungeons. It wasn't a roadblock like that, even though in many ways it was a roadblock to getting into those dungeons. What I mean is, this is what you logged on to do every day. This was like a major part of your character's journey. Nowadays, we think of it simply as barriers to the next stage of content, and that was largely the reason Blizzard phased out attunements during Wrath of the Lich King. But during the Burning Crusade, it was a journey that spanned months and took quite a bit of thought, effort, and teamwork. The attunement process culminated in the Mount Hyjal raid. But to get into that, you needed to get 2 Vials of Eternity. One came from Kel'Thas Sunstrider in the Eye raid of Tempest Keep. The second came from Lady Vash of Serpentshrine Cavern. That's what players were aiming for. That was the goal in sight, Mount Hyjal. But this journey didn't have one defined starting point. We see these big attunement charts these days, right? Showing this super long, complicated, confusing process. But when players took their first steps in the attunement journey, you've You've got to remember that resources like Wowhead, they were in their infancy, and most guides were colossal PDFs you had to download. It was a very different experience to the game today. Generally, the best place to begin was getting attuned for Karazhan, the first 10-man raid of this expansion. But to do this, you would have to get attuned to the Alcatraz. Now, you just needed to get flying to get to the entrance, and then you needed a key to open the door. Now, to get that key, you had to clear the Botanica and the Mechanar dungeons. So that was a lot to do. And once you'd unlocked that gate, and you'd done that, it was time to go to Deadwind Pass. Karazhan is the Wizard's Tower of the Warcraft setting. Such a classic thing, the idea of a Wizard's Tower, and to get into Warcraft's 1, we needed to get the Master's Key. Now, the Master's Key was the attunement here, and you got this by helping out the Violet Eye in investigating arcane disturbances around the tower. And when we do that, we discover that the Master's Key to Karazhan had in fact been fragmented into 3 parts. One of these parts was in the Shadow Labyrinths, another was in the Steam Vault, and the third in the Alcatraz. All these instances required some form of attunement, with the Alcatraz being the most involved, but luckily you're already attuned to that. Next, there was doing a full run of Escape from Durnhold, which was, of course, to unlock the Black Morass dungeon. Now, the Black Morass sent us back to the opening of the Dark Portal, where we could actually just go and ask Medivh himself for the key to his tower. Karazhan was breathtaking. At the time, it truly was. It subverted players' expectations. And that's because it was nothing like the haggard old Karazhan that was depicted in Classic. No, it was this magnificent Wizard's Tower filled with all sorts of unique enemies and interactions. As an example, you've got the famous theater boss fights, which, were straightforward, but they were highly thematic. Or, of course, the chess event, which was definitely fun the first few times you did it. The next special thing about it was that it was a 10-man raid. It was a big shake-up to the 40-man raids that dominated Classic, and it meant that guilds could just get their 10-man teams together quickly, and even the larger guilds could run multiple squads of players. It was an awesome raid, as we all know, and it culminated in the fight with the Eredar Prince Malchezaar in the Twisting Nether. But there was a further boss, Nightbane, and he was of course considered to be the true end boss of Karazhan because of his greater difficulty and his later importance to the attunement process. So yes, we'll be back to Karazhan soon enough. Kael'thas was far away. The first of Illidan's lieutenants to fight was Lady Vash. Serpentshrine Cavern's attunement was actually relatively short. It began with a quest from Skarthis in the Heroic Slave Pens dungeon, and yes, we'll discuss the heroic attunement to actually get to that NPC in a moment. But he would give us a short quest chain, which would culminate in the killing of Gruul the Dragonkiller. Gruul's lair was yet another shake-up. It was only a 2-boss encounter with not that much trash in between the two of them. Now, early in this expansion, it required 25 people to defeat. Gruul was a famously brutal fight, especially for uncoordinated groups of people. He had a large health pool of 3.4 million, and he would periodically grow, which would increase the damage done by him by 15%. So groups had about 10 minutes to get him down, or else that damage would just overwhelm even the best geared of progression tanks. Gruul, when he died, would drop the Earthern Signet, which you would need to hold on to if you wanted to make the Serpentshrine Cavern key. Next, you would need the Blazing Signet. Now this dropped from the optional boss of Karazhan, Nightbane. And to summon Nightbane, you would have to adventure around Outland, gathering yourself the Book of Forgotten Names from Sethic Halls and the Tomb of Dusk from Shattered Halls. So that's 2 more dungeons to do. You would then hand these in to an NPC outside Area 52 in Netherstorm, and then she would give you the Blackened Urn, This is the urn that would of course summon Nightbane. From that point then, it was just a matter of getting your group together, heading back into Karazhan, re-clearing it, and defeating Nightbane. So, with the Earthurn and Blazing Signets, it was then time to go back to Skarthis in the Slave Pens for the Mark of Vash and the unlocking of the Serpentshrine Cavern. Sadly though, you couldn't just go in and get Vash's Vial. Nope. We would need to do a whole lot more attunements to get that quest line. Now, Serpentshrine Cavern itself was the first 25-man raid with a full contingent of bosses, and it really felt like just a big classic raid. But classes certainly were working together a little bit better. Now, it wasn't a memorable thing as compared to some other raids in the game, but it was that first big test for active raiding communities. Now, after Karazhan, Gruul's Lair, and Serpentshrine, you would be attuned to every normal version of every dungeon. Next, then, it was time to get the key for all of their heroic modes, and this necessitated some pretty damn epic reputation grinds. The next big step in the process was getting a Vial of Eternity from Kael'thas in the Eye. Now, to get the key to the raid, players had to complete Heroic Shattered Halls, which required a key from being honoured with Honour Hold or Thrallmar. Next then, Heroic Shadow Labyrinth, which required being honoured with the lower city of Shatrath. And then finally, there was Heroic Alcatraz, which required Revered with the Shatar, and Heroic Steam Vault, which required honoured with the Cenarian Expedition. That's quite a lot of gameplay, and these reputations spanned the new continent, and they were not uniform in their speed or quest distribution. Just as an example, the fastest way to gain reputation with the lower city was with a repeatable quest that was called An Outcast's Plight. This would give you 250 rep for handing in 30 Arakoa feathers. Yes, you got additional dungeon rep from doing Sethic Halls, but if you really just wanted it fast, you'd be doing those feathers. And the overall thing would require 10,080 feathers for 26 quest hand-ins. Now, some were a little more straightforward, such as getting into Shattered Halls. That only required killing Smith Gorlunk in Shadowmoon Valley, who dropped a key for a mold. You then need to get a bunch of crafting materials together, and then you need to kill the Fell Reaver in Hellfire Peninsula, which would finish that mold and give you the key. As you can see, this is quite a lot of stuff to be doing on your character. This was in an era where you weren't hunting down artifact weapon appearances, you weren't getting your renown levels or farming up your anima. No, you were getting attuned. That was the gameplay. That was the journey. And in this case, it was all leading to the Eye. Now attuned with the regular dungeons, their heroic modes, and 3 out of the 5 launch raids, it was time to get attuned to the Eye of Tempest Keep. But first, you needed to get attuned to Tempest Keep. Yes, I know it sounds a little ridiculous now, but before you could begin getting the key to the Eye, you actually had to complete the 5-part Cipher of Damnation attunement. Now, luckily, that attunement didn't actually require any dungeons, other than the odd group quest. You could actually walk through the whole thing yourself. And once that was complete, well, you got a letter sent from Shatrath where you are asked to meet with Hyjal for the Trials of the Naru. Now, these trials required running the heroic dungeons once again, but with some added challenge, like the Trial of Tenacity requiring us to save Millhouse Manastorm in the Alcatraz. Now, after you do the 4 trials, Hyjal would then give you the Tempest Key. The most notable thing out of the Eye raid was, of course, the Ashes of Alar Mount, something that many people still try to get to this day, and of course this was a time where most people had regular griffins, making the Ashes of Alar essentially the coolest thing in World of Warcraft, truly a prestige mount. Finally then, it was time to lock in with the last reputation, the Keepers of Time, and that was needed to get entry to the Battle for Mount Hyjal raid. Once revered, Soradormi would offer the quest the Vials of Eternity, which required killing the final bosses of the Eye and Serpentshrine. Of course, Illidan's two lieutenants, Kel'Thas and Vash. Now, Vash was a relatively straightforward encounter, as by the time players actually got to this attunement, they'd already downed her before. Kel'Thas, on the other hand, though, well, he would remain outstanding until patch 2.1, and because of that, we need to talk about raid clear times. To get a real sense of the amount of effort players actually had to put into clearing these raids, and to really allow you to understand what the attunement process really meant, we've got to look at the kill timers. So this expansion launched on the 16th of January, so that's when the kill timer begins. Karazhan was cleared just 12 days after launch. Then Gruul's Lair and Magtheridon's Lair, well, those were raids that were really tuned for guilds, the type of whom had been farming Blackwing Lair and Nax and Vanilla, so they were incredibly difficult raids for the majority of players at the start of this expansion. But those were still cleared within the first weeks of the expansion's launch. Now, each world first boss kill here was either by top US raiding guild Death and Taxes, or top EU guild Nihilum. And this would essentially be a running theme throughout the expansion and its competitive scene. Serpentshrine Cavern then took a little bit longer, actually being cleared in March. And this is where the story of the World First race really does change and does get weird. You see, patch 2.1 and the Black Temple, they were to launch on the 22nd of May. But Tempest Keep and the Battle for Mount Hyjal still hadn't been cleared. Hyjal was in fact available since launch, but it was held up by bugs. Bugs were kind of rampant throughout Tier 5 raiding, mainly Kel'Thas related stuff in Tempest Keep. This was for a bunch of reasons. To list a few though, several bosses required to unlock Kel'Thas's raid room, such as Alar and Solarian, they were bugged and they would randomly reset the encounter. Now, these problems were much worse with Kel'Thas himself, between things like the legendary weapons mechanic just not working, and Kel'Thas, well, not resetting aggro between phases, which meant that by phase 4, he would aggro on healers, with tanks finding it literally impossible to pick up aggro again. Now, this meant Kel'Thas was unkillable until he was fixed, and as such, players could not get their second Vial of Eternity. Blizzard fixed the bugs, and they dropped all attunement for both Tempest Keep and Serpentshrine with patch 2.1. With those changes, Kel'Thas was actually downed in just 3 more days, and players were finally attuned to the Battle for Mount Hyjal. It is fitting that we end today's retrospective with the Battle for Mount Hyjal. This really was Blizzard's big attempt to bring us back to one of, well, the most awesome battles in the franchise's entire history, of course as depicted in Warcraft 3. It brought back many named villains such as Rage Winterchill and Antherion, but it suffered greatly from the developers' attempts to make it feel more like a real-time strategy game battle, with wave after wave of trash having to be cleared before you could even fight the boss, with there being no way to game it, no way to do the trash faster, to skip it, or anything like that. And that meant that players just had to bash their way through the entire thing, making what initially could have been one of the coolest raids as a spectacle end up being one of the just most chore-like to end up farming. It was meant to be the capstone of the Burning Crusade's launch, but because of bugs and attunements, players were immediately turning their eyes to the expansion's most memorable raid, the Black Temple, which of course is a raid that really should have been cleared way after Mount Hyjal, but those bugs and issues made the whole thing happen a little bit out of sync. So next week, we're going to be diving into the Lord of Outland's Fortress, the lore that underpinned that raid, and why it was considered to be so memorable. We've got a lot more in store for part 2, including the global arena tournaments, the arena PvP system, the Isle of Keldanas patch zone, and the burgeoning World of Warcraft community. Because it really is by this time in the Burning Crusade that the community efforts of World of Warcraft, places like Warcraft movies, the machinima scene, where those really started to develop and flourish. And that is what set so much of the culture that was present whenever World of Warcraft hit its all-time peak. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Certainly is a big, chunky one. Real fun trip through memory lane, and of course, something that soon enough you'll be able to relive with classic The Burning Crusade. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next episode.